saying? I mean, it's like I'm trying to do right. I've been trying to do right my whole life, man. I went to school, man. I went to school, you know what I'm saying? I did everything they asked me to do. And I'm like, sitting home the other day, and I'm like watching the news, man. It's like for every dollar they put into education, they put $50 into prison. It's like for every $2 they put into the social programs, they put $100 in the war. I'm trying to understand this, man.
They closed down another hospital today, and closed down another junior high today, and opened up a few more jails today.
Now, racism never existed on the earth until the 1400s. Never had it. There was no such thing as racism. You had people, for instance, who had practiced various forms of discrimination. We even had slavery. But to be enslaved prior to the 1400s, for only 3 reasons. Either you were a victim of a religious persecution, or you had some indebtedness and was enslaved, or you were a prisoner of war. Those are the only 3 reasons you could be enslaved until the 1400s. About 1442, when Magellan, he went around, Henry the Navigator rather, went around the coast of Africa and picked up about 16 blacks and brought them back in 1442 and gave them to the Pope as gifts. And those slaves worked around the Vatican in Italy from 1442 and about 1488. And it became a good thing to have all these blacks working free around the Vatican and in the Pope space. No labor to be paid for. Other people wanted those advantages. So Pope Pius put out a public edict. Pope Innocent put out a public edict saying, look, if you want some slaves, go get some, but get black folk. He put out a public edict saying, if you're going to enslave anybody, enslave black people. And once that hit, all of a sudden everybody got interested in getting slaves. And that started the whole movement in 1488 and 1489. Now, something happened very important in 1495. Y'all know what happened in 1495? Allegedly, for this guy who was over here looking for drugs and some other thing. What was his name? Columbus. Y'all remember that guy? Now, he came over here and he supposedly discovered America about 7 years after the Pope had put out his edict using blacks as slaves. Now, all of a sudden, he goes back to Europe. A race started. All these countries got into a race to develop the Western world that Columbus said he had discovered. And what was the race about? They wanted to colonize and get resources, wealth, gold, silver, and cash crops from the West, because they never knew that the Americas existed. People in Europe never knew that there was a North America, Central America, and a South America. They got into a contest to explore it and to find it. All through the 1400s, they call it, was going through what's called the Dark Ages. Europe was crime-ridden, impoverished, diseased, and they said, we can resuscitate Europe. We can strengthen this continent, and we can find a way to develop the Western world, the Americas, Latin America, Central America, North America. If we can develop that country, we can bring ourselves out of a ditch as an European continent. And so they all said, well, how are we going to do it? They said, we need a labor class. So they all rushed down and picked up the Pope's edict and started grabbing blacks off the west coast of Africa. It was picking those blacks up on average about $25 a piece. And they started setting up, so they want a 1,500% return of their money. They started selling them for $400-some a piece. And so they started shipping blacks all into this country in Latin America and Central America to put them to work as a labor class. Now, the countries that started at race, it started with Arabs. Arabs were the first ones that started enslaving black folk. I don't know if you all know that or not. Arabs were the first ones that started enslaving black folk, and Arabs have been enslaving black folk now for 1,300 years. Arabs first started enslaving blacks in 765 AD when they marched into Africa in what they called in search of the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold. And they pursued Africa until the 12th century when when they overtook Timbuktu and Timbuktu fell, then they started dominating Africa. But Arabs were the first ones. Portuguese were the second ones. Hispanics were the third ones. then the Germans and the Danes, then the French, then the English, the Norwegians, on down the line. Then lastly was the American Indians. Everybody's enslaved black folk. And that's what a race was. A contest started to develop the Western world. The rule was he who gets there first with the most slaves and make the most money will be the most powerful nation on earth. And the race began. Everybody was in the race. Everybody's enslaved black folk. And that's what a race was. A contest started to develop the Western world. The rule was he who gets there first with the most slaves and make the most money will be the most powerful nation on earth. And the race began. Everybody was in the race to use black folk except black folk. And began shipping blacks into America. And they shipped black folk in. They justified it initially by saying that it was an economic issue. Everybody knew it was an economic issue. It stayed an economic issue all the way from the 1500s up to the 1700s. In the 1700s, when the evangelical movement moved to this country, they switched enslaving black folk to make it a religious issue. Why? Because King James then wrote, when England took over the slave trade as the biggest one and started leading the slave trades and started winning the race, King James rewrote the Bible, called the King James Version. And even had, what's his name now? What's the writer? Huh? Shakespeare and the rest of them writing. All of them rewrote the Bible. And they rewrote the Bible, then since England was the dominating country for slaves, all the slave states were mandated to use scriptures to justify enslaving the black people. So religion then became a means of codifying slavery. Then the slave owners started teaching black folk that when you hear me talk about the master and the slave in the Bible, on earth, it's the white man is the master and you're the slave. And you're mandated to do three things. One, to accept your station in life. Two, to be humble and obedient. Three, to work hard and don't steal and don't lie. And lastly, to look for pie in the sky after death. And that stayed true up until about 1880. At that time, religion was the justification for slavery. This is important for you now. Slavery then moved from being an economic issue to a religious issue. It stayed a religious issue up until about 1859, again on the eve of the Civil War. On the eve of the Civil War, a guy named Darwin, Charles Darwin. Remember Charles Darwin? He wrote a book called The Survival of the Species, or The Survival of the Fittest. And what he's been doing, along with a lot of other pseudoscientists, was trying to connect a linkage between the lowest and the highest in life. What he was saying is that, is an amoeba that's that small, is it greater or smaller than an elephant that's big? Is a blade of grass lower in the chain than a tree? And they kept setting up these vertical systems. They call them genuses and species, going from the lowest of everything to the highest. But by that time, the white society had successfully redistributed by 1860 almost 97% of all the wealth and power into the hands of the dominant white society. The race was nearly over by 1860 or 1859 when Charles Darwin wrote his book. And they looked around and said, look, there are whites, now let's get to human beings. We worked out the relationship between between a bush and a tree and an amoeba and an elephant. But look at the black. The black has nothing, he's on the bottom, and the white master's on the top. He owns and controls everything with all the education. So obviously the white man must be superior to the black man. And so then all of a sudden, racism and the whole issue switched. Slavery all switched from being a religious issue, it became a biological issue. When it became a biological issue, all governments mandated that you must put a person's race on his birth certificate, driver's license, whatever it is. It became a biological issue. But the race was over then. When the race was over, they looked around. And since whites had used slavery for so long, whites own everything. Almost 100% of everything, 99 to 1.5% belonged to the dominant white society. The slave owned nothing. The white was on top, the black was in a ditch. The race was over. When the race was over and blacks had nothing and whites had everything, the race ended. And what the society did then, they took the word race, R-A-C-E. They scratched the E off the end of race and stuck a suffix called ISM. ISM is a suffix which means keep the prevailing conditions, let nothing change. And that's where racism came from. The race was over. Whites wanted, they had everything. They took the E off the end of the word and stuck ISM. That's what racism is. Racism is a competitive relationship starting out to get wealth and resources and power.
The nation is destroyed from this, and yet they cast stones on the communities of those in poverty. Economically, the selfish are the reason they exist. You're not rich when you stole everything that you get from our whole country to the ideas of playing the bricks, from the religions to the images you got from ancient Egypt. The monument racism is disguised by the communists who want to bring in this one world plan, but don't want to accept that it will be led by one man who's a spiritual, loving, family, intuitive being. The only way I'm agreeing if she's leading in our world.